When the mountains wore caps of snow, Benj and Peter gathered the flock together to lead them down to the valley. The sheep stood patiently by the gate while they were being counted, Rollo at the rear of the flock and Biddy at their head, ready to lead at a signal from Benj. Over 100 sheep they now were, sleek and fat with the wool growing deep and firm. Peter felt sad at the loss of the 6, but Benj shook his head. It was a cruel thing, but we can't grieve over the past. That there were no more lost is what I think about. That was Biddy's doing. It was. She fought for her own freedom, but she won because of her lamb. A sheep will do anything for its lamb. Instinct, some call it. What do you call it, Benj? Not by any name. It's just the knowing something's weaker and turns to the stronger and older for help. He looked at the boy for a moment. You know how it is, Peter. When anyone expects you to do something fine, you can. They let the sheep through the gate one by one, then closed it behind them. Biddy stepped aside, and the flock moved slowly past her. Benj called to her to go forward, but with her lamb beside her, she stepped back a pace or two nearer the gate. Biddy says our count is short. Benj made a brief comment. Peter laughed. She can't count the way we can. Maybe she can't. But I'm not the one to go against her word. Hold them, Rollo. The dog, at Benj's command, sprang to the head of the flock and blocked the road so the sheep could go no farther along it. Benj and Peter moved among the flock, counting again. What do you make it, lad? Just 2 over 100. That's what it is with me. Benj looked puzzled. It's the 6 the wolf got she's missing. But how to tell her they aren't coming back with us is more than I know how to do. Peter thought fast. Shall I take 6 of the flock and circle around the hill, then come down through the pasture and join you as if we'd just found you? Biddy was pushing at the grass in an unconcerned way, her plump bobtail rump toward them, but Benj spoke in a low voice, for he would not have her hear them. I'd rather be fooled 10 times myself than fool her once, he said, but you'd best do it, Peter, or we'll not get home this evening. Peter singled out 3 of the more tractable ewes who were immediately followed by their lambs. He started down the road, then swung off it on the side away from the place where Biddy was grazing. He knew of a gap in the fence where the wire had once been strengthened. Reaching it, he twisted back the new pieces of wire and made an opening for himself and the sheep to crawl through. They hesitated for a moment, bleating questioningly as they found themselves being led back to the pasture they had just left. But at a few persuasive words from Peter, they followed him through the opening. They were used to being obedient, and so long as Peter went first, whom they knew, and who was so like one of them in his brown coat with its familiar smell, they went after him. Peter looped the wire together behind them and started up the first of one of the low hills. It was a rocky place where the sheep seldom grazed. There was little enough to graze upon, but for some reason or other, the sheep had never seemed to like that particular hillside. There were deep clefts in the rocks, and Andrew had once told Peter that there must be caves under them. The sheep were hesitant. Peter called to them in the low, soft croon he had learned from Benj, a sound of magic, for once hearing it, they would follow anywhere. They took a few steps forward, then stood still again. Peter knew that sheep disliked going over a hilltop, fearing the unknown other side. But the plan to fool Biddy would come to nothing if they didn't go over the hilltop and swing down from it to the gate. Come along, Peter said, stamping his foot impatiently, a thing Benj had told him he must never do. The sheep stepped backward toward the fence, their hooves slipping on the sharp rocks. A ram lamb baaed arrogantly. You're just silly sheep, Peter retorted, and, acting as if he didn't care what they did, started up the hillside. There were boulders at the top, and he picked his way carefully among them. Suddenly he stopped still, gripping a rock and flattening himself against it. Not 10 paces from him was a gray wolf, and around her 4 well-grown cubs were playing prettily, if anything that spelt so much horror could be pretty. His hands felt like ice on the rock. Water coming from a spout would have had more strength to it than his legs had then. A tuft of flowers, growing in a cleft in the rock beside him, was bending in the wind, bending away from the wolf family, so heedless of their visitor. Peter was glad the wind was blowing against him. He inched himself back along the rock, through the tangled boulders, then turned and raced down the rough slope. There was no need now to call the sheep to follow him, for they had already taken themselves down to the fence and were standing there waiting. One lamb had even squeezed himself through, and the ewe was standing with the wire between them, baaing plaintively. "Silly sheep indeed," Peter said to them. "You've got more sense than a boy who goes to school." His fingers were trembling, but he undid the wire quickly and made an opening. The sheep crawled through first, following the one who was impatient to reach her lamb. Peter wriggled himself through. There was a rending sound, but he was in too much of a hurry to reach the other side to notice it. He raced across the grass onto the road. Benj saw him and the 6 sheep coming from the opposite direction than he expected them. "Benj," Peter called. Then he blurted out the whole story to the old shepherd. Benj nodded. "So that's what we've been feeling all summer. So that's why the sheep never went to graze on that little hill." Peter shivered. So close the wolves had been to the sheep. So little any of them had known. "The mate of the male I got last spring," Benj said, piecing things together, "and her litter." "But why didn't they trouble the flock?" "The cubs were too small, and the mother had her hands full caring for them. But let winter come, and the cubs be full grown, and every farm in the valley would know it." Benj had turned round and was looking back toward the hills. What are you going to do?" "I'm not going to lose any time. That's one thing I'm going to do." "You haven't your gun." "I'm making a trap." "But the bait?" Benj had worked in among the flock as they were talking. He laid his hands on a lamb that had only half the growth the others had. It was a runty little ewe, early marked for market, as there was no bone in her worth breeding. "If I can do it with the lamb alive, I will. If not," Peter knew what Benj meant, even though his thought dangled like a cord in midair. To safeguard the farms in the valley, the flock in another summer, the cost of a single lamb would not be considered too much. Peter stretched out his hand and stroked the head of the little lamb. It looked up at him and bleated softly. "Take the flock home now, Peter," Benj was saying, "and tell your father when I come I'll have 5 pelts on me as well as my own, and a runt lamb beside me, I hope." Benj turned to Biddy. "Are you for leading them now?" The ewe looked up. Her jaws moved sideways, then she baaed deeply and walked slowly toward the head of the line. Rollo sprang to his pace. Peter waited until the flock had got on its way down, then he took up his stride behind them. He turned once to wave to Benj and the little lamb. Benj walked back up the hillside, and it was David who walked with him. Not the stripling who strummed a harp, but the warrior who spoke with authority. "I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied." Only Benj did not say armies, or if he did not think it. He said flocks. Toward evening, when the shadows were lengthening and the cows had gone out to pasture after the milking, Martha and Andrew were glad to see the flock winding slowly down the long road to the valley. Biddy, the dark one, was at their head. Behind her, the mass of tawny-coated sheep were pressed so close together in the narrow road that one might have walked on their backs. Rollo could not be seen, but a bark could be heard now and then, coming sharp and clear in the still air. Martha caught the first glimpse of her son in many weeks, and even at that distance, she could see that he had grown taller. Her heart gave a leap of pride. He was trudging along a short distance behind the flock, and the dust from their many hooves swirled up around him. Martha waved, but he did not see her. Then she hurried indoors to prepare the supper. It would be a feast tonight, with the flock in the barn and Peter and Benj at the table again. "Martha," Andrew called, "Benj isn't with them." "Are you sure?" "I've been watching for 5 minutes, and there's just the boy." Andrew was not worried, only wondering. An hour later, Peter reached the home meadows. He folded the sheep in their enclosure, then ran toward the house with Rollo beside him. Biddy walked placidly about, inspecting the place, her long-time right of liberty still assured her. Peter was covered with dust. He was thirsty and tired, but the greetings came first. His mother's arms about him and the smile of his father standing nearby, pleased that the flock had come safely through another summer. "Where's Benj?" Peter told in a quick, excited way the story of the she-wolf and her cubs, and of how Benj was lying in wait for them, with no weapon but a half-grown lamb. "Andrew, shouldn't you go up to help him?" Martha thought of the gun standing in readiness. He shook his head. "Near midnight it would be when I get there. No, Benj has his own plans, and I'm not the one to interfere with them." They turned and went into the house. Martha, assured about Benj, could turn her joy undiluted to Peter, but before she set the dinner on their plates, she took a bowl of freshly pared raw potatoes and turnips, and going to the door, called Biddy. With short, gay steps, the sheep came over the grass, baaing gladly. Martha set the bowl down, and Biddy's nose was soon deep in it. "Come on in when you've a mind to, Biddy. I've left the door ajar." There was a low, deep sound of happiness, and then the sharp crunch as teeth broke into the crisp delight of garden vegetables after a summer of grass. Peter was carrying a steaming dish to set on the table, and Martha was behind him with a loaf of fresh bread when she saw the tear in his coat. She stifled an exclamation until the dish was safely set on the table. "Peter, another rend in your coat, and it must last you through another winter." He looked up at her in surprise. Then his eye ran quickly over the front and sleeves. "Where, Mother? I didn't see any tear." She put her hand on the place between his shoulder blades where the wire had ripped into the wool. Peter still looked puzzled. Then he remembered what had happened when he had crawled through the fence. After dinner, after Andrew and Peter had gone out to the barn and pasture to see that the creatures were content, and Martha had set the clean dishes away on the shelves, they gathered together in the kitchen. There was a brave fire in the stove, and the glow of light and feel of warmth reached far across the room. It was good, for the first chill that had prefaced the long cold of winter was already on the land. Peter sat on the floor and told his parents of the summer. Biddy, lying in a corner with her feet tucked under her, was silently chewing her cud. Every now and again, a short, deep baa came from between her lips, as if she would echo all that Peter was telling them. Martha sat at the table under the lamp with Peter's coat in her hands. Slowly and skillfully, she brought the two sides of the rent together, and all around it she wove back and forth with brown wool, like that from which the coat was made. "The flock looks sound," Andrew was saying. "You've had no trouble with them, no sickness?" "No, Father." Peter was proud of the summer behind them. "Not a single sheep took sick." "No accidents?" "One of the lamb broke its leg early in the summer, but it mended soon." "So," Andrew exclaimed, "what did you do to it?" Peter had forgotten the horrid feeling he had felt inside him when Benj found the lamb and called him to help with it. It was bleating miserably, a part of one of the forelegs dangling like a pendulum. The ewe was standing over it, helpless and distraught. Telling of it, Peter remembered only the ease with which Benj succored the lamb and the rapidity with which it had recovered. "Benj set the leg in place as neatly as you'd set a stone in a wall," Peter said lightly. Then he laid 2 straight branches from a tree on either side of the leg and bound them all together with a piece of cloth he ripped from his shirt. Andrew nodded. "The bones of the young ones are soft and knit quickly. How did you keep the lamb off its legs?" "Benj carried it for near a week," Peter smiled. He made a pretty picture with the ewe following him wherever he went. Martha had been going over the coat carefully, catching a thread here, patching a frayed part there. She laid it on the table and looked at it, smoothing it with her hands. "There now, you'll have the winter's wear from it if you treat it well. I'll wash it tomorrow and iron it out, and then it will be ready for school." School, Peter thought, and it was something to think about. Boys and girls instead of sheep, books and pads instead of misty distances filled with thought. By noon the next day, Benj appeared, true to his word, with 5 wolf pelts in a bundle over one shoulder, and over the other the hide of a half-grown lamb. "I'm sorry about that, Andrew, but it had to be," he said, when he told him the story of how he had tried to lure the wolves into his trap with the scent of the lamb only. "But it wouldn't do. It's the meat they're after, and only the promise of it could outdo the smartness of their brains. Once they had it, they walked neatly into my snare." "If the little one has saved the flock, and other farms too, I'm not minding," said Andrew. "That's a fair hide she made." Benj turned and went to the water to wash his knife. He spent a long time at it before he felt sure it was clean. Wolves were not heard of again in that countryside. No tracks were seen in the snow during the winter, no hungry howling came on the frosty wind at night, and none of the farms knew loss. "There are some things," Benj commented on it to Peter, "that can't seem to live right with the rest of the world. They cause trouble to the good things, and so they have to leave. I don't like what has to be done at times like that, but," he sighed heavily, "a man's got to be able to do it." David was able, wasn't he, Benj? Benj thought a long time. He was so, and he wasn't afraid to stand up to a big one named Goliath, who was causing trouble in his countryside. Easy going is the way we all like it to be best, but we can't let easiness take the fight out of us.